who will be happy? That's what we're going to talk about today in Matthew 5. Hi, this is Jill from the North Woods. I remember when I did this podcast, the whole thought going on in my brain was, this was such a long, it was a long day to record this, and it was a long day for all the people who were there with him. A lot of people in commentaries feel like the Sermon on the Mount, which is what we're going to talk about today, was probably a standard speech that he gave that we know of about 52 days, I think it came to, in the Bible. In his 3.5-year ministry on earth, Jesus did things every day, but only 52 days we can differentiate in the Gospels, in the New Testament, and in Acts. So he must have said very similar things when he went to various places. He must have said the same message. Again, if you have a speech, your president gives a speech, we're all going to see it. We're all going to see it live. We're going to watch it later. We're going to read the transcripts of it. And this time, to get a message out, you have to go and talk to each place individually. So we believe, in general, and we'll see two incidents of it. There was Sermon on the Mount, and then there's Sermon in the Prairie, which was primarily a very similar speech given in 2 different times and in 2 different locations. Now, the one thing to keep track about Matthew is that Matthew's order is a little bit different than most of the other Gospels. And primarily it's because he is writing a college paper on Jesus and the prophecies fulfilled. And he's organizing it in a logical way. He has reorganized the stories of the New Testament in a way that makes sense to the structure of this thesis he's giving, that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything the Jewish people have been waiting for, him included, whole life. We've all been waiting for it, and here it is, and here's why. We're going to see some differences with Matthew in primarily order and details, because he cared about certain details while other people cared about other details. We made it through Matthew 1 through 4. Everything's cooking along really good and going great. This whole experiment of us doing a Bible study together, just as lay people, I'm not, like I said, theologically trained, going great. And then, get to Matthew 5, and suddenly, oh goodness, it is going to be a lot of detail, and it's going to be trickier words. Bible studies are interesting because you can do them in many different ways. You can do word for word Bible studies where you're scholarly, you're looking up every Greek, every Aramaic, every Hebrew word. You can do a cultural study of it. Like I said, we're doing more of an inductive Bible study where we're looking to see what is actually being said. In this podcast and now on this video, this is where I really had to do a lot of digging, because sometimes the words that are used are not exactly the words we think of. We also remember, too, that the chapter headings in the Bible itself, as we're reading them, are not biblical. The chapters are not something the Bible had originally. These were just big, long letters. They are broken down into these chapters and verses so that we have organization. So I could say, hey, Bob, did you read Matthew chapter 5, verse 3? We can pinpoint a place and I can tell you where it's located. It's an organizational method for us. But likewise, each of the chapter headings are not biblical. It's what someone called them in order to do that. And in this case, people call them the Beatitudes. And other people say it's the Beatitudes, the attitudes you should have. Well, that's pretty clever. But essentially, what does it mean to be in this Beatitudes? And we try to think, who am I in all of this? What represents me? There are things that we're going to read in the Bible and you'll say, oh yeah, that's me. Or there's places that you're going to read in the Bible and you say, that's not really my issue. I really don't have that issue. And in this case, we're going to see what sounds like things to us sounds like us, and some things that don't quite sound like us. And this isn't even a checklist of strengths and weaknesses where you can say, I'm not very poor, but I'm a really good mourner. In fact, we're going to say that all of these things are things that we should be doing and considering. And in fact, most of the commentaries and the way that people look at the Beatitudes is their steps. You are on the first step. You are on the second step. And they all lead together into the same action. They are not just one over the other. I'm going to pick and choose and say, I'm a really good mourner, or I'm going to work better on my mourning. It's not like that at all. Jesus is holding everyone from the lowliest person to the highest person, from the workers in the field to the Pharisees and the Sadducees from the temple, and going through and talking to everybody there. We all need this Sermon on the Mount. And it's not even so much for salvation. Jesus is going to do the work of salvation. This is so we can live a more godly life, a more God-centered life, that we can live a happier life, because we're going to find out in a minute what does blessed mean. And some of the ways, the attitudes that Jesus wants us to take in our lives. And if we do these things, we're going to live the life of the ultimate joy, and it'll put us on the right track to when we get into our eternal glory, understanding the values and principles of the kingdom. I guess that's just the best way to do it. And God invented us, and he invented us to be on this planet. And now he's giving us this instruction of how to live there. Again, whether you're a fisherman or a farmer or a Pharisee or a scribe, he comes out right away by saying that the Pharisees that were there were a pit of vipers, that as the creator of your body, this is how you should be going about life, but you're not getting there. You're trying to the kingdom of heaven by following all these rules in a way that makes you prepared for the kingdom of heaven. And he's saying, instead, this is how you're going to have the kingdom of heaven here. This is how you're going to have richness on earth. This is how you're going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, because Matthew is not going to say God, he's going to say heaven. We get those phrases too, where people go, oh, heaven knows. It's a way of saying God knows without saying the word God. And people would do that in Judaism because they did not want to take the Lord's name in vain. I think as Christians, we take the Lord's name in vain. We think of it as something a little bit else. But when it comes to what it means, it will say blessed are and fortunate. But it's weirder than that. It's deeper than that. When you say blessed, what does that mean? And it can be interpreted happy are. But it's not, oh, I went to Disney World today and boy, I'm happy. It is the ultimate happiness, the godly happiness. Your life will be truly happy deep down in its roots, as compared to I went to Disney World today and my day is happy. The Bible Project mentions it that if you met the person who is the happiest human being on the planet, this is what that is. Blessed are. That's going to be the happiest of happiest people. They could not possibly be happier. So if you go up into the mountains, they talk about this. It wasn't to escape the crowd that was now following Jesus everywhere. Instead, think of it more like stadium seating. That this was a place where he could get a lot of people in a small area of places where they could see and hear him. And so it was an opportunity for him to speak to many people. And so the first one we start out is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I do this Bible study in ESV, and in the show notes it talks about their copyright license. And everything I read in this Bible study, for the most part, unless I'm quoting someone else, is in ESV. And so what does it mean, poor in spirit? And you read about it, and different people have different opinions about it. A lot of people think, oh, these are the people who are poor, destitute. They don't have anything. And that may be too. I think that the poor in monetary things can be poor in spirit. And it's easier maybe in some ways for them to be poor in spirit because they have nothing else to depend on. They are so brokenhearted. They are so far from being able to rely on anything else in their lives that God is all they have. That's what poor spirit is. I think rich people can get there. I think middle class people can get there. They can be poor of spirit. And then they're going to find that this kingdom of heaven is all theirs, that they are inheriting this. And it's because they had nothing here, either if it's monetary or if it's just taking joy in the pleasures of earth, of anything that people have. They're going to get everything in the kingdom of heaven. And the word spirited, what exactly is like poor in spirit? Spirit is what we think of when we have a spirited horse, right? He's bucking. He's trying to get out of the enclosure. He won't listen. He won't be instructed. We can't train him. And so I think that's the sense that you should take the word spirit. If we're rich in spiritedness, that means we're bucking everything God says. We're not taking instructions. We're not listening to what he has to say. We're thinking and talking about ourselves and our own positions and our own education. And instead, when we're poor in spirit, we are saying, I'm accepting what God gives me. I'm accepting his grace. I'm accepting how I have fallen short of the kind of being I need to be in every way. I rely on God for everything. And I'm going to take his lead. I'm going to follow in the way of his path. And like I said, in some ways, I think it is easier when you're poor to be poor of spirit, because I grew up really poor. And when you didn't know if your parents were going to be able to pay the bills, if you were going to be able to ever, I don't know, get you shoes for school in winter, it's easier, I think, for you to have a dependence on God because it's all you have. For me now, I'm not poor anymore. I'm not poor like I was when I was a kid. And so it gets easier for you to say, I'll just save up and I'll buy this, or I will do my own thing because that's what I really want to do. It's easier to have a strong willpower. So I think there are challenges for people to be poor in spirit. I'm not going to buck the rules. I'm not going to be that wild horse that's trying to get out of the cage and trying to resist all training. We know, according to Isaiah, that the same rules apply to the rich and the poor alike. We know that we're all supposed to be dependent on God. Then it says that blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And the mourning is not just about death, although death is the ultimate penalty for sin. We weren't supposed to die. We weren't supposed to be in this position, but we are. And so mourning is for death because it wasn't supposed to be what happens with us. But I also think about mourning as like Jeremiah, who was called the crying prophet. He ripped his clothes. He wept over the sins of his people. He is so devastated because of the way that things go on in this world. And I think that when we look at the world and the brokenness and we watch the news and we see how people are at each other's throats and there's wars and all the things that go on in this world, we mourn for the world that God wanted us to be in. We mourn for that kingdom of heaven. We're not quite there yet. When we see sin glorified everywhere, we mourn. I mean, it makes me sad when I see people go against God. I see interviews with stars or all the TV shows, right? And almost every TV show you look at, they'll say, you don't believe in a God, do you? And the person will be like, oh, no, of course not. They gloat about this. They gloat at the fact that they're not living a godly life. I was reading an interview with a musician, and she was talking about how she just has sex with everybody, and she's having the time of her life. And I thought, it's not how God intended us to do. It's not how we were meant to have relationships with each other. It's not the relationship we should have with God. It just makes me sad. And I'm not saying I'm a good mourner, but I can see places where I do mourn for the world, where I see people treating this earth terribly. There are places I mourn sincerely for everything. And I think God wants us to be there. But in fact, we have to think too that God is going to be the comforter, not the blanket. He is going to comfort us in our mourning, that we know in the end he wins, and that the kingdom of heaven is going to be, like what he wants it to be. And with God being our comfort, with God being the one who consoles us, then that's going to help us overcome this mourning that we have whenever we see, the state of the world or the state of our relationships with each other or the state of anything. We're going to be able to go through and see that. The next one is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And again, the word meek is a little bit interesting. It talked about Jesus being meek and humble on a donkey. It is a little bit like spirited. Meek is meaning that we're not demanding and asserting our rights, and we're not turning against God and turning against our fellow people. Instead, it's more like that concept of turning the other cheek. Okay, God, I gotcha. Jesus was meek. It's a strength. We don't think of it as a strength in our world. In fact, these people who are bold and audacious, and we go, wow, that basketball player, he's so proud of himself and he's so audacious about his celebration in the end zone. And God is saying, no, I don't want you to be that person. Jesus could have brought in angels. Jesus could have ridden into Jerusalem his last time on a chariot pulled in by angels, and he didn't do it. The Greeks wanted strength and boldness. We want strength and boldness. God's not telling us to do that. He's telling us to be meek. He's telling us to have that attitude around us of meekness. I think of it as a side of humbleness, but it's a little bit different too. The next one, he says, blessed are those who are hungry, for they thirst for righteousness, and they will be satisfied. And again, in this world, or at least where I live, we don't have hunger the way we had hunger. But hunger at that time, this would have been something they understood. Like when you're hungry and you're starving to death, and even as a kid, even though I was poor, I was never starving to death. But when you're in that position where if you don't work, if you don't make enough money to feed your family, people go hungry. It's a yearning in you. It's biologically in you to just crave the thing you cannot have. That's the kind of hunger and thirst we have in this world for justice, that we want righteousness. And righteousness is going to be people living that godly life. That's what Jeremiah was weeping about, was righteousness. And we want to have that kind of yearning, that hunger and thirst for the world to be righteous. And we see it in bits and pieces too. When we see, oh gosh, I saw this woman who got her house taken away from her because she missed a payment for a month. And you say, oh man, where's the righteousness in that? Where's the grace and the kindness in this? We long for a world where we treat each other better, where we treat God better. There's two kinds, right? There's the kind of righteousness we have between me and you, and then the righteousness we have between me and God, and all of us and God. But in this day and age, we sometimes don't long for that. I'm reading a book by Spencer Clavin. He's talking about how science first thought, oh, chemicals. We're all just chemical creations. Then electricity got invented. Oh, we're all just electrical thought patterns. Now we're just biological systems. We keep coming up with these things that we try to do to describe ourselves as just chemical and electrical meat bags that are just reacting. And there's no God out there. There's no standard out there. There's no way that we're supposed to work. Therefore, murder's not wrong. There is no wrong. There is no rights. We are just animals. Instead, we see we're computer code. We're genetically coded to be real people attached to God. He brings the ultimate righteousness to earth. He came here and lived as a standard for all of us to live, taught us how we should live, gave us these books so we could read about it and find out how to live. And when we see that not happening and we're thirsty for it, like thirsty to the point of dying, hungry to the point of dying, we want that. We want that for this world. He says then, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And we're going to see this as we go through the Gospels, that those who give mercy get mercy. Those who forgive get forgiveness. We're going to see a lot of times where he says this. And in this particular case, mercy is giving something to someone they don't deserve. They deserve X, but you decided to be merciful to them. And when you're merciful to them, you will gain mercy too. In a sense, this is, again, this kind of a thought that if you don't give people other mercy, why should you get other mercy? We're going to see parables about this as well, but we screw up all the time. We don't do the thing we should have done. We do the thing we shouldn't have done towards our brothers and sisters, towards God in heaven. And we are glad that God is merciful to us, and yet we don't extend that same mercy to other people. The next one is, blessed is the pure in heart, for they shall see God. People who are pure in their heart, I think, don't just see God when we get to the kingdom of heaven. They have this ability to see the right and wrong in this world, and they have the ability to see God everywhere. They can see God, they know what God is, and they are able to recognize him in this world and in the next. They know that the right way to go. They know the way that God would want them to go because they're pure of heart. They have the right glasses on. They have the right goggles on that they can see God. I always joke when I go biking that whenever there's a rut right in the middle of the biking path, if I look at it, I go right into that rut. Like I keep thinking in my head, don't go in the rut, don't go in the rut, don't go in the rut. And I go into it 9 times out of 10. But instead, when we look at the good thing, when we look at things that are pure, when we look at things that are godly, we go towards that direction instead of the thing that we're trying not to do. Think about it too. Let's say you were addicted to gambling and you were driving in the countryside and you're going to pass this casino on the right side of the road. If you stare at it as you're going down the right side of the road, don't gamble, and you're just thinking about that all the time, chances are you're going to gamble. But instead, what you do is you focus on the good. You focus on God. You will see him. You will make your hearts pure in God's way. The next one is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be sons of God. And I think that the reason is that the pure see God is that they're looking at God's standards. But now when we are peacemakers, we're looking at God's standard for making peace. We're not supposed to quarrel with people. We'll find out in Romans. Much as it's up to you, live at peace with everybody. Jesus was the Prince of Peace. We are supposed to be living a peaceful life with each other, with God. We're not supposed to be having wars and conflicts and mothers against fathers and daughters against mothers. And we're not supposed to be in conflict like this. And yet we live in a planet of conflict. That's the devil beaming in pride. When we see conflict, we're supposed to de-escalate these things. And I'm not saying if you see someone committing a crime, you should say, oh, that's okay, you just go. I'm saying that when it comes to conflict, when it comes to battling with our neighbors, we're not supposed to be going there. We're supposed to be bringing peace. And if we can go ahead and bring peace among each other, that is it. We are doing work that God wants us to do, and that brings us into being sons and daughters of God. When we're bringing in battle and we're not making peace, again, I'm not talking about defending a country or defending people who are being injured or harmed in a certain way. I'm talking about just outright raising up conflict with people. That's when we can be sons of God. I'm talking about us battling with each other, having fights with each other. As much as it's up to me, am I living in battles with other people? As much as it's up to us, can we live in peace with each other? The next one are, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Again, another group where it's going to be persecution follows Jesus. He said it himself, that what we do is we take up his cross and follow him. He told his apostles that they were going to be persecuted. Every one of them were murdered for their faith, and John was exiled on an island until old age, where he was let off the island and wrote his gospels probably. Whenever you speak the truth of God, people might get persecuted. That's just the way of the world. You might lose a job. You might offend someone. You may suffer for it in many different ways. And we have the kingdom of heaven coming for us. We saw people, too, like Bonhoeffer, who stood up to the Nazis, and he was persecuted for it. Corrie ten Boom. We could go on and on. But people, when you do the righteous thing, they are going to get persecuted, and the kingdom of heaven is going to be theirs. And then he says, blessed are you who others revile you, persecute you, utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is in heaven. Again, there were persecuted prophets. There's people like Bonhoeffer and Corrie ten Boom. And Jesus said it, that blessed are you when others revile you, persecute you, utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. He knows it. We're going to be persecuted. A lot of people were persecuted. Prophets were persecuted. He was persecuted. He knows it firsthand. And it's just something that's going to happen. And so then you might sit to yourself and say, wow, this was a lot, right? It was a lot. oh my goodness, this was a lot of information to soak in. Like I said, those people are sitting here listening to it live, and some of them probably weren't literate, and so they couldn't write this down. But instead, now Jesus goes on to talk about more. He says that we should be the salt of the earth. And salt, first of all, was something that was valuable. There's a whole book out there called Salt, and it was about how salt was like the very first resource that was valuable. People in the army got paid in salt. It was one of the very first things that got smuggled. Armies were built on the fact that you could preserve meat with salt. It was something that you could do. It's something our bodies need. It's valuable. It's important. And then he says, but if the salt loses its saltiness, what good is it? And we think, how in the world can salt lose its saltiness? Because salt just is, right? It's not just something that's going to lose, but it can get diluted. It can get spread out. It can get thrown out into the ground so it's not even distinguishable anymore. It's not something that you recognize unless it's very dense and together. If I go take a cup of salt and I throw it into Lake Superior, it's not going to make Lake Superior salty, right? It's gotten so diluted, you don't even know there's any salt in there. And that's what's going to happen to us. We get diluted. We get thrown into the ground. It's lost its value. It's not something that we're going to reclaim again. And then he says that we should be the light of the world. We should shine our light of God that's in us. And this is one of my favorite passages. I always really love the light passages. You have to recall that back in those days, light was very expensive. There was a study that was done that said that back in 1950 BC, it took 400 hours of work for 1 hour of light because it was so expensive. There was olive oil, there was animal fats. This was very expensive. You could have eaten the animal fats, but instead now you're deciding to burn it. Now, light is so abundant to us. It's like a second of work to produce an hour of light. We have light everywhere. In fact, we probably have too much light everywhere, but we have light everywhere. At that point, you would never take something so valuable as light, light it on fire so you can see inside of your room or your house, and then put a basket on it so that you can't hide it. God does not want us to live the Christian life hidden. He wants us to live the Christian life boldly, to shine the light of God everywhere. We are his light. And when we hide our faith, when we don't say the things that we're supposed to do, we are taking something valuable like light and using it for no good. It produces nothing of value. So he's saying that this is where we're going to have to be the light unto the world. Now, I'm a camper, and I think that you don't realize how dark the world is until you go camping someplace that has no real light, until you have seen true darkness. There was a story about when there was a power outage in Los Angeles, people were calling in because they saw this weird thing in the sky, and it turned out it was just the stars. People hadn't seen real stars in such a long time. They thought something was wrong with the sky. Light is valuable, and so when Jesus is talking about this light, he is telling them how valuable it is that you have light and that you keep going. And then he says he didn't come here to abolish the law, but instead, he wants us to know that not one iota of it is going to be gone. And if you were a Pharisee, you were going to try to accuse Jesus of trying to say, I'm the law, or you don't have to do the law anymore. Those guys were trying to do every ounce of the law that they possibly could, and they put laws around laws. So if you said, I have to celebrate the Sabbath, when's the Sabbath? Oh, it's when 3 stars are on the horizon. He wants us to have Sabbath. He doesn't want us to sit there and know the exact instant Sabbath happens. All these laws of the Old Testament, every inch of it, he says, every dot, every piece of ink of the law, not one of them is going to be removed until all of this is accomplished, till Jesus comes to fulfillment. And he is not absolving the law. He's fulfilling the law. He is going to tell us later what the law is to us. If we relax any single one of these laws, these commandments that God teaches us to do, we'll be least in the kingdom of heaven. Before we were talking about being blessed in the kingdom of heaven, and now we're talking about the least of it. But everyone who does the things that God wants us to do will be great in the kingdom of heaven. And so then you had these Pharisees, these smart people, the scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers who are studying all of this. trying to earn their way to getting into heaven, preaching about, like I said, every single one of these pieces, how you ritually wash your hands, how you watch a cup, how you live in Sabbath, how you do this and how you do that. They were trying to do all of this, and they are not going to be able to do it. Nobody can be perfect in this, no matter how hard you try. And if they even can't do it, we're not going to come anywhere close. And so, again, this is going to be in this bucket of successful living, not in order to reach God, not in order to reach heaven, but in order to have blessings here on earth. We are going to want to live God's way so that we can do it, that we can have a successful, God-focused life here as much as we can while we're still here. And now Jesus has come to save us, because otherwise we'd be stranded, because we can't be perfect. We can't do it all. And in the end, we don't reach heaven because we did a great job. We reach heaven because God saved us from it. And so even in these passages before, he's talking and he knows that there are Sadducees, Pharisees in this audience. And so when he says these things, he is also speaking to them. He's not here to remove the law. He is there to fulfill it. And so he knows that they're going to hear this. It's for them too. It's so that they know what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that when you think about the Sadducees, thought that we were doing good for the people because they were negotiating peace for the people against the Romans, and before that, the Greeks. They had saved the people from the Greeks. The Pharisees think that they're doing a good job because they're trying to follow every dot of God's law so that they can be holy. Everyone thought that they were doing a great thing. So now he goes on to talk about anger. And he says that if you have anger in your heart towards your brother, that is like committing murder. If you call him a name, there's this word raka, which is just essentially, it's like a term of disgust. The whole word is not so much the meaning of the word, but it's just, bleh. You are liable to the fires of hell for murder. And obviously murder is a serious crime, but when you're angry against your brother, you are committing the same crime, and you need the same kind of forgiveness. We are not supposed to treat each other poorly. Like I said, all of these things he's saying is about how we face each other and how we face God. And in this particular case, when he's talking about anger, he is telling us how we should be facing each other. And you might say, I was just mad at this person, but at least I didn't murder them. And that's good that you're not murdering, but you are still committing that same exact sin with hate in your heart. We shouldn't hate our brothers. We shouldn't hate people around us. We shouldn't be glad when they suffer. And then it goes on to say, same thing with lust. If you have lust in your heart when looking at a woman, you've already committed the sin of adultery, even though you didn't act on it. And obviously, like I said, the sin of adultery is very bad because you're hurting your wife, you're hurting your spouse, you're hurting your family and your children, you're hurting the woman that you're looking at. We face temptations all the time, right? That we see something we want and then we covet it. Or we see maybe someone who's good looking and we covet them. Or we have a flash of anger for someone. Or like I said, when something bad happens to people, we're like, ha, good for them. Thoughts cross our mind all the time. And some of it's us and our sinful flesh. Some of it is the devil putting thoughts into our brain. But we don't have to dwell there. We don't have to live there. We don't have to dwell on it. If you had that flash moment thought of something, walk away from it. Flee sin. Get away from it. You don't have to dwell, because as soon as you start dwelling on your anger, on your lust, on how you feel towards other people, it will start to turn into actions. And so then he goes on to do another, this is a big long chapter here, but it says that it is better for you if your body part causes you to sin, your eye causes you to sin, cut it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Because it's better that you lose this body part than be thrown into hell. And there are people in the past who have done such things. Boy, there was like a Little House on the Prairie. I forgot what happened. The mother got sick and her hand, I think her hand was infected and she was going to cut it off because she remembers this Bible passage. It is not telling you to cut off your body parts. It is an example, an analogy of how devastating sin is. It is so devastating that you should avoid sin, that you should turn away from lustful thoughts, that you should turn away from your hand doing something offensive and sinning. The Pharisees would get into marriages and then maybe their wives couldn't cook, or maybe they're not pretty anymore. They got older, just like the Pharisee got older, but now they want to go and get a new wife. They would come up with this whole litany of reasons about why they could do that. Or I even think about, what exactly is adultery? And you start trying to become this lawyer where you're trying to see what kind of thing it takes to break the law. And God's saying, don't do this. We always talked about that in college too, where we would sit around and say, what exactly is breaking God's law? Is it holding hands with your boyfriend or your girlfriend? Is it kissing? How far is too far? And we were trying to be lawyers about this, and God is saying, this all starts in your heart. This all starts with what's going on inside of you. It's not just about your actions. And so if you're coming up with all these rules, and the Pharisees, like I said, came up with rules so that they could follow every dot of every rule, in your heart, you have already sinned. And Pastor Novotny, I was listening to a podcast of his the other day, that it's not so much that, like I said, when you look at someone, you flash an anger at them, that's the part that's a sin. But it's now when you're starting to dwell in it and going, wow, that guy's really gorgeous. Or you look a second time. He says the second time is the problem. It's not just the observation, oh, that guy is pretty good looking. Or, boy, I'm pretty mad at that person. That's pretty terrible. But now it's when you're actually dwelling in it. You've hit this, wrong territory. You've gone this wrong direction. And then he goes on to talking about divorce. Like I said, this is a big, long day. And saying something that under Moses allowed divorce, but that's because the people's hearts were far from God, that they were falling away. And again, they're in the desert. They're married to people. And he says that was a circumstance that was given to people, but divorce is not meant to be what happens. When you divorce your wife, and if she marries again, you will make your wife an adulteress. You're putting her in a sinful position because she got married again, even though you got divorced. And women at that time had very little choice. If a man divorced a woman, they had no land, they had no income, they had probably no way to feed themselves. So marriage was something that was a structure that God gave us in order to care for each other. And he's saying that when you divorce someone, you're causing harm to your wife, you're causing harm to your kid, you're causing a devastation to your entire family. It's not just, oh, I'm just going to go get divorced. And again, he's probably speaking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees who figured out ways to allow themselves to get divorced. And now, even in our times, it's so easy for us to get divorced that we don't even have to think about it. We don't even think about the kids or what impact it's going to do for them. Now, there are places where there's abuse, there's drug abuse and addiction. There's places where someone in the family just up and left. I had a friend of mine whose mother just up and left them. And the poor father raised those kids the whole time. And we think it's fine. It's fine. But that's not what marriage is supposed to be. Marriage is supposed to be forever. And then he warns against swearing oaths. And this is not something people always wonder too. Is this like swearing an oath to the military or to your nation? This is a little bit different than that, because we see that there have been places where in the Bible, people did swear oaths in courts of law, that kind of thing. He's saying you don't have to go to extremes to say something. Just say yes or no. I'll do this thing or I'm not going to do this thing. It's a sign when you're kids and someone says, I swear I didn't do this. And they go on and on about how they didn't do something. And they're like, oh yeah, you totally did this, because a person who didn't do something wouldn't go on to this extent and say this. Instead, your word should be your word. When you say yes and when you say no, that means you're going to do those things, that you're going to promise things that you're going to keep. That's the kind of person you are. And that's what the Pharisees used to do, is they'd swear oaths. I swear by the heavens, or I'd swear as you as my mother, I did not say those words. And they were lying. It was just a way of being so extreme. He's saying, just don't do it. Yes or no. That's all you have to say. You don't have to go on and keep doing this. You don't have to go on and keep making up bigger and bigger oaths to swear in order to cover up the fact that you're lying. And then he goes on and says that if someone hits your left cheek, give them your right. If someone wants to take your shirt, give them 2 shirts. If someone wants you to go a mile, you go the extra mile. And this is an opposition of being vengeful, being retaliatory, or just doing the bare minimum. So the idea was, and we saw this in the TV show The Chosen, that if a Roman legally would be able to ask someone, hey, you carry my stuff, they could only make you carry it a mile. And so people hated it and they were mad about it. And instead of being snotty about it, instead of being angry about it, instead you're going to go and you're going to carry it another mile. It is about not having vengeance, not being angry. Giving the other cheek just means you're just going to have that kind of personality that just says, okay, I'm going to do this because I'm going to do more than you say. I'm going to redeem this thing. You told me I have to carry your armor for a mile. I tell you what, I'm going to carry it for 2 miles because I'm going to take something that you're making evil in my life and I'm going to make it good. I'm going to go above and beyond. Boy, that's a hard lesson to follow. He says that we should love our enemies. It's really easy to love your friends. We all love our friends. We love our family. We love people we love. And when we love our enemies, people who persecute us, it shows us exactly the kind of God we have. God is a God who loves his enemies, who goes out of his way for people who hate him. And we are supposed to take on that very appearance of it. People who do bad things against us. It says that God sends rain on the just and the unjust alike, meaning life is going to happen to everyone, good and evil. Good things are going to happen to good people. Bad things are going to happen to good people. Good things are going to happen to evil people, and bad things are going to happen to everybody. But instead, we should just love everybody. God is a God of love. He is perfect. He expects us to be perfect, and yet he loves us. It's easy to love people we love, but God, he loves everybody, and we should be taking on those same aspects that he gives to us. And then he goes on and says, then be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And the one thing we can't be is perfect. We're never going to be perfect, but he calls us to try. He calls us to work on it. And he says, don't worry, help is on the way. He is sending us help. He sent us his Redeemer. He's going to send us our Holy Spirit to help us in all these things. And people, we're supposed to love people, whether they're Christians, they're non-Christians. There are even some reactions to this. Nietzsche called this in his book, The Genealogy of Morals, that meekness and all of this is a slave mentality. That instead of all these things that Jesus is telling us to do, we should act like someone who's in charge, not like someone who's a slave. And I'm sure that the Romans, the Greeks, they're bold people who like to take action. They wouldn't have liked this either. They're not people who want to be meek, who want to be mournful, who want to seek righteousness, who want to love their enemies, walk the extra mile. All of this is going to be, this whole speech is going to be against a group of people who think none of this is what they should be doing. It was interesting. When I was in Israel, there's still ruins of a place that's called Church of the Beatitudes, which is where this happened. In theory, it's on Mount Aramis. What I'm going to meditate on is this whole idea of what God tells us happiness is. He's the God who made us. He knows what makes us tick. He knows how we work. And when he says that these are the things that are going to make us happy, those are the things that are going to make us happy. And so I'm going to meditate on those things. And what I'm going to pray about is that I have the strength to do those things. We try to go after the things of this world. We think that a good retirement plan is going to make us happy, that having a great income is going to make us happy. And certainly everything we have on this earth is a blessing from God. But what makes us really happy are these things that are here too. And what I'm going to share with others is that they need to focus on this happiness too. And don't get distracted by the things of this world. They can just lead us astray, bring us into hate and anger and lust and things that we didn't want to do. And God is trying to tell us the things that really matter here. Wow, there are a lot of things going on in Matthew 5. I knew this was going to be long. It was long when I did the podcast as well. Wow, it is a lot. And I hope you're doing well. I hope you can tell me how you're doing. You can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. I'd love to hear from you. Put it in the chat. like this channel, watch it, and leave me comments. I'm curious to see how it's going for you. Thanks so much for listening.